A teacher humiliated a black boy just because he came from a farming family. She did not know who his grandfather was, and that the next day her lessons would be interrupted by a helicopter landing in the school field. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're watching from. The sky above the small town of Willow Creek was still tinged with shadows when Malik Brown awoke to the familiar sound of the rooster crowing in the distance. The air outside his window carried the faint scent of damp soil and fresh-cut grass, a smell he had known all his life. It was the same every morning, reliable as the rising sun. At 15, Malik had grown used to early mornings that began long before his classmates had even considered stirring in their beds. The world beyond his small wooden house remained dark and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of trees swaying in the southern breeze. He rolled out of bed without hesitation, his movements slow but practiced, and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He could already hear the low murmur of the television downstairs and the soft creak of the back door as his mother stepped outside to begin her own day. Malik dressed quickly, pulling on faded jeans, an old gray t-shirt, and a worn flannel jacket that smelled faintly of hay. His boots, covered in dried mud from yesterday's chores, sat by the door, waiting. Downstairs, the kitchen light cast a warm glow over the scratched wooden table and the chipped white cupboards that had been there longer than Malik had been alive. His mother stood by the counter, her back to him, packing lunches into brown paper bags. She glanced over her shoulder as he entered, offering a tired smile. "Mornin', baby," she said softly. "Mornin', Mama," Malik replied, grabbing an apple from the bowl on the table. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten to a soft lavender hue as he stepped onto the back porch and inhaled deeply. The scent of damp earth filled his lungs, grounding him. The fields stretched wide and endless beyond the barn, the soil rich and dark beneath the faint mist clinging to the ground. For most people in Willow Creek, it was just farmland. For Malik, it was home. The animals stirred as he approached. Chickens clucked lazily in their coop, the cows shifted in their pens, and the two horses in the corral stomped softly in the dirt. He moved through his chores methodically, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and making sure everything was in order before the sun had fully risen. His fingers worked quickly despite the lingering soreness in his muscles from the day before. By the time he was finished, his grandfather's truck was already rumbling down the dirt driveway, kicking up dust as it came to a stop beside the barn. The old man stepped out with the same quiet authority he carried everywhere, his broad shoulders wrapped in a thick canvas jacket, a faded baseball cap pulled low over his brow. "Mornin', boy," he greeted, his voice gravelly from years of hard living. "Morning, Granddad," Malik answered, wiping his hands on his jeans. They worked together in silence for a while, checking the irrigation lines and inspecting the newly planted crops. Malik had long ago learned that his grandfather wasn't one for unnecessary conversation. His lessons came not in words, but in actions. The way he walked the fields, the way he listened to the wind, the way he ran his calloused fingers through the soil and seemed to understand what the land was telling him. By 6:30, Malik's clothes smelled of hay and earth, and his hands were rough with dirt. He knew he had just enough time to wash up before heading to school. His mother's car was already waiting when he returned to the house, the engine running, the back seat littered with papers and empty coffee cups from her night shift at the grocery store. The drive to school was quiet, as it usually was. Malik sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the sprawling fields that lined the road, the sun now a bright sliver peeking over the horizon. His mother glanced at him once, her fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded, though the tightness in his chest never really left. It had been there for as long as he could remember, the weight of knowing he didn't quite fit in with the kids at Willow Creek High, the ones who wore brand-name shoes and talked about vacations and college plans over iced coffees. When they pulled up to the front of the school, Malik grabbed his backpack, offered a quick goodbye, and slipped out of the car. He didn't linger. The courtyard was already buzzing with students, most of them clustered in tight groups, laughing and scrolling through their phones. The faint smell of perfume and cologne hung in the air, mixing with the scent of freshly mowed grass. Malik kept his head down as he walked through the crowd, his worn boots clunking awkwardly against the concrete. He heard the whispers as he passed. "Isn't that the farm kid?" "Yeah, that's him. Always smells like a barn." "They say his granddad owns some land, but who even cares about farmers?" Malik pretended not to hear. He had learned long ago that reacting only made it worse. Inside, the hallways were just as loud. Posters for the upcoming career day plastered the walls, encouraging students to dream big and dress for your future. The irony wasn't lost on him. He knew exactly how that day would go. His locker was near the end of the hall, wedged between two seniors who barely acknowledged his existence. As he spun the dial and opened the metal door, a few crumpled papers spilled out, remnants of assignments he had forgotten to turn in, half-finished notes he had written, during moments when he'd tried to concentrate despite the exhaustion gnawing at him. The first bell rang, signaling the start of another day. Malik grabbed his books and made his way to his first class, careful to avoid the gaze of his classmates. It wasn't that he disliked them. Most of them probably didn't even notice him beyond the occasional joke or comment. It was the unspoken distance between them that weighed on him the most. The invisible line drawn between the kids who came from families of doctors, lawyers, and businessmen, and the boy who spent his mornings mucking out stalls. His first class, English, passed in a blur. He tried to focus, but the words on the page swam before his tired eyes. The teacher called on him once, and he mumbled an answer, earning a few snickers from the back of the room. By the time history class rolled around, Malik was running on fumes. He slid into his seat at the back of the room, trying to make himself as small as possible. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and floor polish, the hum of the overhead lights buzzing in his ears. Ms. Hudson entered the room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She was always impeccably dressed, her hair pulled back tight, her expression pinched and disapproving. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it never reached her eyes. Malik knew she didn't like him. It wasn't something she ever said outright, but it was there in the way she looked at him, in the way she called on him more often than anyone else, her voice always carrying that subtle edge. He kept his eyes on the desk as she began the lesson, trying to stay awake, trying not to draw attention to himself. But as the minutes ticked by, he could feel her gaze settling on him like a weight. "Malik," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the classroom, "pay attention." He straightened, mumbling an apology as the other students glanced in his direction, some smirking, others simply indifferent. By the end of the period, Malik's shoulders ached from the effort of keeping his head up, his eyelids heavy despite the sharp chill of the air-conditioned room. When the bell finally rang, he gathered his things quickly and slipped out of the classroom, avoiding eye contact with Ms. Hudson. The rest of the day passed in much the same way. Whispers, sidelong glances, the quiet knowledge that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be the farm kid to them. When the final bell rang, Malik didn't linger. He walked straight to the parking lot where his mother's car waited and climbed inside without a word. The ride home was quiet, the low hum of the radio filling the silence. At home, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. Malik kicked off his boots by the back door and headed out to the barn without being asked. There was always work to be done. As he shoveled hay and checked the animals one last time before nightfall, he let his mind wander. Tomorrow was career day. He already knew what he would wear. The same thing he wore every day. Because no matter how much they laughed or whispered, this was who he was. And though the weight of their judgment pressed heavy on his shoulders, somewhere deep inside, a quiet, stubborn flame continued to burn. He just didn't know yet that soon the whole town would see it. The next morning arrived with the same stillness that marked every dawn in Willow Creek. Outside Malik's window, the horizon blushed faintly, the early light slipping over the endless fields like a soft whisper. The quiet hum of crickets gave way to the occasional lowing of cows and the distant rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. Inside the small wooden house, the day began not with fanfare but with the rhythm of responsibility, a rhythm Malik had long learned to match. He sat at the edge of his bed for a moment longer than usual, the exhaustion of the previous day lingering like a weight in his bones. His fingers rubbed at his eyes before he stood, stretching briefly before reaching for the same pair of worn jeans folded neatly at the foot of his bed. His boots, dusted with yesterday's dirt, sat by the door like old friends waiting for him. Today wasn't supposed to be like every other day, not in the eyes of the school. Today was career day, a day meant to showcase dreams, ambitions, futures still being shaped. For Malik, there was never a question of what to wear. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive with quiet movement. His mother stood by the sink, wiping her hands on a towel as the kettle hissed gently on the stove. She looked up when Malik entered, her eyes tired but warm. "You sure about this?" she asked without preamble, her gaze flicking to the flannel shirt draped over his arm. Malik shrugged, grabbing an apple from the counter. "Ain't much point in pretending to be something I'm not." His mother studied him for a long moment, the lines around her mouth deepening. She knew the weight he carried, the invisible mark that seemed to follow him through the school hallways. She had spent years trying to protect him from it, though she knew better than anyone how sharp the world's edges could be. "If that's how you feel, then wear it proud," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Outside, the sun had barely begun its climb when Malik stepped onto the porch, the morning air cool against his skin. He paused for a moment, glancing toward the fields stretched out beyond the house, the rows of crops neat and orderly beneath the waking sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the rest of the town was already stirring, preparing for a day of polished appearances and bright smiles. The drive to school felt longer than usual. His mother's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her gaze flicking toward him every few minutes. Neither of them spoke much. The radio murmured softly in the background, filling the silence between them. When they pulled up to the school, Malik hesitated briefly before opening the door. His mother reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. "Keep your head up," she murmured. "They don't get to decide who you are." Malik nodded, the words settling somewhere deep in his chest as he stepped out of the car and made his way toward the school entrance. The courtyard was already buzzing with activity. Students milled about in clusters, their laughter and chatter floating through the cool morning air. Bright colors flashed everywhere. Students dressed in lab coats, business suits, scrubs, and flight attendant uniforms. Some wore police badges, others carried toy briefcases. Everywhere Malik looked, the message was the same: ambition, aspiration, image. He walked through them like a shadow. His own clothes were a stark contrast to the polished costumes around him. Faded jeans with worn knees, a checkered flannel shirt buttoned neatly to the collar, and his old brown boots, freshly wiped but still carrying the marks of labor. A simple baseball cap shaded his eyes, the brim low over his brow. He felt the stares before he saw them. Whispers fluttered like dry leaves on the wind. Is he serious? Look at him. Came dressed like he's going back to the barn. Guess he doesn't need a costume. That's all he'll ever be. Malik kept walking, his steps even and measured. He had long ago learned that silence was the strongest armor. Inside, the halls were no different. Posters announcing Career Day lined the walls, bright letters shouting slogans like "Dream big" and "Your future starts now." Teachers stood at their doors, offering smiles and polite greetings as students passed, their eyes flicking over costumes and taking mental notes. Some stopped to compliment the most elaborate outfits, a few even snapping photos for the school's social media page. No one stopped Malik. By the time he reached his locker, the air felt heavier. He could feel the weight of the stairs pressing in from every direction. The hall was alive with movement, but around him there was a small pocket of quiet, people whispering, glancing, nudging each other. He opened his locker mechanically, exchanging his books with a practiced efficiency. The conversations around him were a low murmur, but certain words still floated to him. Why even bother? He could have at least tried. Typical. Malik's fingers tightened around the edge of his locker door, the metal cool and solid beneath his hand. He didn't respond, didn't look up. He knew how this day would go. He had known the moment he'd stepped out of the house wearing the same clothes he worked in every morning. The first few classes passed in a blur. Teachers made a show of complimenting the students' outfits, weaving discussions about future careers into their lessons. Some paused to ask students why they had chosen their costumes, encouraging them to speak about their ambitions. No one asked Malik. When the bell rang for history, Malik's steps slowed almost imperceptibly as he approached the classroom. He could already hear the rising chatter from within, the excitement still lingering in the air. He took a breath and stepped inside. Ms. Hudson stood at the front of the room, her arms folded neatly across her chest, her expression unreadable. She wore a crisp navy blazer over a white blouse, her dark skirt pressed to perfection. As always, she looked immaculate, composed, distant. Her gaze swept the room as the students filed in, lingering for a heartbeat longer when it landed on Malik. He felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a stone. The classroom quieted as she began to speak, launching into a lecture about the Industrial Revolution and the shaping of modern America. Her voice was smooth and clipped, her words rehearsed and precise. Malik tried to focus, but the exhaustion from the morning's chores tugged at the edges of his mind. He scribbled notes mechanically, his eyes flicking occasionally to the clock. Then, halfway through the lesson, Ms. Hudson's voice shifted. "Since today is Career Day," she said, her tone light but edged, "perhaps we should take a moment to reflect on the future each of you envisions for yourselves." She glanced around the room, her gaze stopping briefly on a girl in a lab coat, then a boy in a crisp suit. "And some of you," she continued, her eyes settling deliberately on Malik, "have chosen to embrace their roots rather literally." A few students snickered. Malik felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his gaze fixed on his notebook. "Tell me, Malik," Ms. Hudson said, her voice smooth as silk, Do you plan to inherit the family farm, or perhaps aim higher and become a stable hand?" The classroom erupted in quiet laughter. Malik didn't look up. His pen hovered motionless over the page. Ms. Hudson didn't stop there. She continued, her words sharp and casual all at once, weaving the lesson back into the conversation as though nothing had happened. But the message lingered in the air, heavy and unmistakable. By the time the bell rang, Malik's shoulders felt like lead. He gathered his things slowly, waiting until the room had mostly emptied before standing. Outside in the hallway, the buzz of career day continued, students still posing for photos, teachers still smiling politely. But for Malik, the day felt heavier than the others. He made his way to the cafeteria, weaving between groups of students who barely noticed him. As he sat at an empty table near the back, he let his eyes drift across the room. Everyone seemed to belong to something, dressed in uniforms that spoke of futures filled with possibility. He knew that, to them, he was just the kid who smelled like earth, who wore the same clothes every day, who would never be anything more than what he already was. But they didn't know everything. They didn't know the man who had built their future from nothing, who had shaped the very ground they walked on. They didn't know the quiet pride that lived in the Brown family, passed down from hands that had tilled soil and fought for dignity. Malik's jaw tightened as he took a slow breath, his gaze dropping to the worn fabric of his shirt. They would know soon enough. The air in the hallways felt heavier by the time Malik walked back toward history class. The faint smell of floor polish and adolescent perfume mingled together in a way that always made his stomach churn. Career day was still in full swing, though the morning's novelty had begun to fade into routine. The excitement that had pulsed through the corridors earlier now lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter, something not meant for him. Students brushed past him, their footsteps quick and careless. Laughter echoed down the halls in scattered bursts, and though none of it seemed directed at him in that moment, Malik felt it pressing against his skin all the same. It was the kind of laughter that lived in whispers behind your back, in glances that lingered too long, in smiles that curled a little too tightly at the corners. He walked into the history classroom quietly, taking his usual seat near the back. The familiar scrape of the chair legs against the linoleum floor sounded louder than it should have. As he settled into his seat, Malik glanced up briefly, just long enough to catch the expression on Ms. Hudson's face. Her eyes swept the room methodically, calculatingly, until they landed on him. She didn't smile, but the slight lift of one brow was enough to send a ripple through the air. Malik lowered his gaze, focusing on the edge of his desk, tracing the scratches in the wood with his thumb. The bell rang sharply, cutting through the hum of idle chatter. The room stilled. Ms. Hudson began her lecture without fanfare, her voice smooth and practiced as she outlined the day's topic. The lesson was on labor in post-Civil War America, the transition from slavery to sharecropping, the economic disparity that had lingered long after emancipation. Her words filled the space effortlessly, each sentence punctuated with historical facts and dates. Malik listened, his mind tugged in two directions at once. Part of him focused on the lecture, on the history that felt like a shadow beneath his own skin. Another part hovered elsewhere, drifting between the weight of his classmates' stares and the heaviness that had settled in his chest since that morning. It wasn't until halfway through the period that he realized Ms. Hudson's gaze had returned to him. She paused at the front of the room, her arms folded neatly across her chest, her lips pressed into something almost resembling a smile. "Since today is all about careers and futures," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the classroom, let's talk about the labor force in the South, specifically about those who worked the land. The shift in her tone was subtle, but Malik felt it immediately, a current of unease prickling at the back of his neck. She turned slightly, her eyes never leaving him. Malik, she said, her voice light, almost casual, why don't you tell the class what you know about sharecropping? The room seemed to hold its breath. Malik blinked, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. He opened his mouth, searching for an answer, but the words tangled in his throat. His mind raced back to the textbook, to the lecture, to the facts he had tried to memorize, but exhaustion gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, dulling everything. He started, then stopped, the heat rising to his cheeks. Ms. Hudson's smile sharpened, her head tilting slightly. Come now, she said smoothly. I'm sure someone with such close ties to the land would know a thing or two about it. A few students snickered quietly. Malik's stomach twisted. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. Sharecropping was when freed slaves rented land to farm, but they had to give most of the crops back to the landowners. His voice was barely audible, but he pushed the words out anyway. Ms. Hudson nodded once, then tapped her fingers against the edge of her desk. Close enough, she said. And what happened to those sharecroppers, Malik? What became of them? Malik stared down at his desk, willing the floor to swallow him whole. They stayed poor, he murmured. The silence in the room stretched thin, taut like a wire about to snap. That's right, Ms. Hudson said, her voice cool and crisp. They remained in poverty, generation after generation, bound by the same land they worked. She let the words hang in the air for a moment longer, her gaze still fixed on him. Some things, she added lightly, never change. The laughter this time wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. A few students covered their mouths, others exchanged glances across the room. Malik sat frozen, his face burning, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ms. Hudson turned away then, resuming her lecture as if nothing had happened. Her voice drifted back into facts and dates, her tone smooth and impassive. Malik heard none of it. The weight in his chest pressed heavier with each passing minute, his ears ringing faintly beneath the low murmur of her voice. He stared at the notebook in front of him, the words on the page blurring until they became meaningless shapes. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Malik moved slowly. He waited until most of the students had filtered out before standing, gathering his books with mechanical precision. His legs felt unsteady beneath him as he stepped into the hallway, the din of voices crashing over him like a wave. He kept his head down, his footsteps quick and quiet, weaving through the crowd without looking up. The laughter and whispers followed him like shadows, soft but unrelenting. By the time he made it to the front doors, the air outside felt too bright, too sharp against his skin. He took a deep breath, willing the tightness in his chest to ease, but it remained stubbornly lodged beneath his ribs. The ride home passed in a blur. His mother glanced at him once or twice, her brow furrowing slightly, but she didn't press. Malik kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching the fields roll by in muted shades of green and brown. When they pulled into the driveway, the sun had begun to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Malik stepped out of the car without a word, his footsteps heavy as he made his way toward the barn. The familiar scent of hay and soil greeted him like an old friend. He moved through the evening chores mechanically, feeding the animals, checking the fences, brushing down the horses. Each task provided a small measure of comfort, a rhythm he could lose himself in. It wasn't until he finished, the sky now streaked with deepening shades of orange and purple, that he finally allowed himself to stop. He stood at the edge of the field, the wind tugging gently at the brim of his cap. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted, it had only settled deeper, heavier. Behind him, the back door creaked open. "You're working late tonight," his grandfather's voice rumbled, low and steady. Malik didn't turn around. "Just wanted to finish up." His grandfather walked up beside him, silent for a moment as they both stared out at the horizon. "Your mama said you came home quiet," he said finally. "Quieter than usual." Malik's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the distant line where the fields met the sky. "It's nothing," he muttered. His grandfather didn't respond immediately. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with understanding. "You know," his grandfather said at last, his voice thoughtful, "when I was your age, I worked these same fields, came home tired, dirty, and not a soul in that schoolhouse thought I was worth a damn." Malik glanced at him then, just briefly. "They thought I'd never be more than the dirt under my feet," his grandfather continued. "Some folks still think that." Malik swallowed again, his jaw tightening. "She said I'd never be anything," he said quietly, "that people like me, like us, don't change." His grandfather was quiet for a long moment. "She's wrong," he said finally. Malik nodded once, the motion barely perceptible. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of soil and rain. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Malik replayed the words over and over in his mind. The laughter, the whispers, the weight of eyes that had looked at him and seen nothing. But beneath it all, his grandfather's voice lingered, steady and unyielding. "She's wrong." Malik didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but something inside him had shifted, and soon enough the whole town would see it. The next morning arrived with the same stubborn inevitability as every other. The sky, painted in soft shades of gray and lavender, stretched over the horizon, indifferent to the weight that pressed against Malik's chest. Birds called faintly from the trees lining the edge of the fields, and the hum of distant tractors echoed like a pulse through the still air. The land, as always, waited to be tended. Malik moved through the motions of the morning without speaking. His mother's quiet glances at him over breakfast, the subtle furrow in her brow, the careful way she touched his shoulder as he reached for his backpack. He registered all of it, but said nothing. There were no words he could find to bridge the gap between what had happened yesterday and the day ahead. His grandfather stood at the door when Malik stepped outside, arms folded loosely across his chest, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his worn cap. He didn't say good morning, nor did he ask if Malik had slept well. Instead, he simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and Malik nodded back. They both understood something had changed. The drive to school passed in silence. Malik stared out the window, the landscape blurring past, the fields stretching endless and familiar. His mother's fingers tapped rhythmically against the steering wheel, a habit she always fell into when her thoughts were too loud to keep inside. But she said nothing, and neither did he. At school, the hallways were louder than usual, filled with the echo of laughter and hurried footsteps. Career day had come and gone, but the residue of it lingered like a bad taste. Malik kept his head down as he walked, ignoring the sideways glances, the hushed whispers that followed him like shadows. He moved from class to class mechanically, barely hearing the teachers' voices, barely registering the words on the page. The world felt distant, as though he were moving underwater, the pressure pressing tighter against his chest with every breath. By the time the final bell rang, Malik felt hollow. At home, the air felt heavier, quieter. He stepped out of the car and made his way to the barn without a word, his footsteps slow and measured. The animals stirred as he approached, the soft sounds of their breathing a kind of comfort amidst the noise in his head. He worked methodically, moving from task to task with practiced ease. His hands moved without thought, muscle memory carrying him through the motions even as his mind drifted elsewhere. It wasn't until the last of the animals had been fed and the sun had dipped low in the sky that he finally allowed himself to stop. The air smelled of hay and soil and something heavier, something that clung to his skin like sweat. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against his face. His grandfather stood at the edge of the field, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Malik approached slowly, the weight in his chest settling deeper with every step. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the tall grass around them, carrying with it the distant sounds of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. "She said I'd never be anything," Malik said finally, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. His grandfather's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. "She said people like me don't change, that I'd never be more than what I am." The older man exhaled slowly, the sound soft and steady. "That what she said?" Malik nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His grandfather was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the darkening sky. "You know," he said finally, his voice low, "I've been called a lot worse in my time." Malik glanced at him then, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. "First time I set foot in that schoolhouse," his grandfather continued, "they didn't want me there. Didn't matter how smart I was, how hard I worked. All they saw was a poor black boy from the fields." He paused, the memory settling heavy between them. "I thought if I worked hard enough, they'd change their minds. Thought maybe one day I'd walk through those doors and they'd look at me different." His gaze shifted to Malik, sharp and steady. "They never did." Malik swallowed, his throat tight. "But I'll tell you what," his grandfather said quietly. "It didn't matter, because I knew who I was, and I knew what I was worth." He fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Malik didn't respond. He couldn't. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, his grandfather sat alone at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his weathered hands. The glow of the single overhead light cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the lines etched into his skin, the years of hard work and quiet struggle. He stared down at the table, his thoughts turning over slowly, deliberately. He had spent his entire life building something from nothing. Every acre of land he owned, every dollar he'd earned, had been the result of sweat, grit, and stubborn determination. He had fought for everything he had, carving out a place in a world that had never wanted to give him one, and now, watching his grandson carry that same weight, the same quiet shame, the same burden of other people's judgment, it lit something inside him, something old and fierce and unyielding. He reached for his phone. The next morning, the house hummed with an energy Malik couldn't quite place. His mother moved through the kitchen with an edge to her movements, her eyes flicking toward the front door every few minutes. His grandfather sat at the table, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured. Malik ate his breakfast quietly, watching them both, the unease in his chest growing heavier. After school, when Malik stepped through the front door, his mother met him with a look he couldn't quite read. "Your granddad's got something planned," she said quietly. Malik frowned. "What?" She shook her head. "You'll see." That evening, after the chores were done and the sun had dipped below the horizon, Malik found his grandfather outside, standing beside the old truck, his arms folded loosely across his chest. "Got a call from the school," his grandfather said without preamble. Malik's stomach dropped. "They want to meet." Malik hesitated. "What about?" His grandfather glanced at him, one brow lifting slightly. "About yesterday." The words settled heavy in the air between them. "Don't worry," his grandfather added, his voice calm but firm. "I'll handle it." Malik didn't know what that meant, but he trusted him. That night, the house was quiet again. The only sound, the soft murmur of the television downstairs and the distant hum of crickets outside. Malik lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts restless and scattered. He didn't know what his grandfather was planning, but something told him that by tomorrow, everything would be different. And deep down, beneath the ache in his chest and the weight in his stomach, a small spark flickered to life. The quiet, stubborn flame of something that had been growing for a long time. It wasn't over. Not yet. The morning dawned with an unusual hush. Willow Creek, so accustomed to the quiet rhythm of fields and sky, seemed to hold its breath as if the earth itself anticipated a shift in the ordinary. The usual sounds, birds rustling in the trees, the whir of an old lawnmower in the distance, the slow hum of school buses rumbling down rural roads, were present but softened, distant, as though something larger loomed just out of view. Malik awoke as he always did before the sun had climbed above the horizon. His alarm clock buzzed faintly in the pale morning light, but he was already awake, lying still in the quiet room, staring at the ceiling. The events of the last 2 days weighed heavily on him. Ms. Hudson's cutting words, the laughter of his classmates, and the silence that had followed. It sat on his chest like stone, cold and unmoving. Downstairs, his mother moved with quiet purpose. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast, but the usual warm conversation was missing. Malik stepped into the room to find her seated at the table, hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her gaze distant. His grandfather wasn't there. Malik hesitated, then asked, "Where is he?" "He left early," she said, her voice low. "He say where he was going?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Said he had something to take care of." Malik didn't press. He ate quickly, the toast dry in his mouth, the coffee lukewarm. He gathered his things and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the sky above a pale wash of blue streaked with early clouds. He waited at the edge of the driveway for his mother to join him, watching the horizon as if it might offer some explanation. The ride to school was quiet. His mother kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the radio dial, though she never turned it on. Her knuckles were pale where they gripped the steering wheel. Malik sat silently, his eyes trained on the passing fields, their wide, empty expanses a strange comfort. When they reached the school, students were already milling about the front entrance, laughing, talking, clustering in the ways they always did. Malik stepped out of the car, pulled his backpack onto one shoulder, and made his way toward the doors. Whispers greeted him, as they had since career day. Nothing direct, just the hiss of soft laughter, the press of glances, the brief silences when he passed. He ignored them. Classes passed in a blur. He sat through English, science, and math without hearing a word, his mind adrift. Even the usual mutterings behind his back seemed quieter today, less focused. Something felt off. The energy in the building was twitching, waiting. It wasn't until lunch that the first sound broke through the day's strange quiet. A low, distant thumping, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat growing louder. At first, no one noticed. The cafeteria was its usual cacophony of trays clattering, voices rising, and feet scuffing tile floors. But then the sound deepened, becoming unmistakable. The chop of blades cutting through the air, closer and closer. Students paused, glancing up. The noise grew louder, thunderous now. Conversation died out. A few teachers stood, moving toward the windows, craning their necks to look outside. Malik sat frozen, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him, his breath caught in his chest. The loudspeaker crackled. All students and faculty, please remain calm and proceed to the football field in an orderly fashion. This is not an emergency. The room erupted in motion. Chairs scraped back, voices rose in confusion, laughter, disbelief. Malik followed the stream of students pouring out of the cafeteria, his heart pounding in his ears. Outside, the sky had turned brilliant blue, the clouds drifting lazily above. The sound of the helicopter was deafening now, echoing between the low buildings of the school. Every student and staff member stood frozen as a sleek black helicopter descended slowly onto the football field, the dust from the dry grass swirling in furious clouds around it. Teachers shielded their eyes, students grabbed their phones, and someone gasped aloud. Malik stared in stunned silence. As the blades slowed, the side door of the helicopter opened with smooth finality. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a clean, pressed dark jacket and boots that gleamed like polished leather. His hat bore the insignia of Brown Agricultural Group, but even without it, everyone would have known who he was. William Brown walked with a steadiness that needed no announcement. The noise of the helicopter faded, but a different kind of hush fell over the field. Eyes turned, phones lowered. Even the teachers, including the principal, stood without a word as the old man made his way across the grass. Behind him, a second figure emerged, Malik, called forward by a wave of his grandfather's hand, his heart thudding with every step. He followed slowly, his boots brushing against the flattened blades of grass, his mind still struggling to comprehend what was unfolding. The crowd parted before them like water. The principal moved quickly to meet them near the 50-yard line, a look of anxious politeness plastered across his face. "Mr. Brown," he said loudly over the wind, offering a hand. This is unexpected." William Brown did not take the hand. "I'm here to talk about what happened in your classrooms," he said simply. "Of course, if there's a misunderstanding—" "No misunderstanding," he said. "My grandson was humiliated in front of your students, not for lack of effort, not for misconduct. He was humiliated because of where he comes from, because of me." The crowd murmured, rippling with tension. Students exchanged glances. Teachers looked toward one another, uncertain. "I built the land that feeds this town. I fund the science wing in your school. I support your history program. Ms. Hudson's very salary, as I understand, benefits from our family's endowment." The principal faltered. "Mr. Brown, with all due respect—" "Respect?" William turned, his voice rising just slightly, enough to carry to the furthest row of students. "Respect is not something you reserve for certain families. It is not something you give to those who wear fine suits or speak without an accent. Respect is earned, and it is owed. Especially to a boy who rises before the sun to help feed this state, who comes into your halls exhausted but unbroken, and who still has the strength to sit through your lectures while being laughed at for what he wears." Malik stood still beside him, his hands clenched at his sides, his throat tight. "I raised that boy to know that soil under your nails is not shame," William said, his voice now quieter but sharper. "It is pride. It is legacy. It is what built this country long before any of you set foot in it." There was a long, ringing silence. Then, from the crowd, a single student began clapping. Another joined, and then another. Soon, the entire student body stood in applause, not loud, not thunderous, but honest. Some clapped with wide eyes, others hesitated, unsure, but the sound grew. Ms. Hudson, who had stood at the back of the gathering crowd, pale and stiff, stepped forward finally. Her expression was unreadable. She glanced at Malik, then at William. "I owe your grandson an apology," she said quietly. William looked at her, then stepped back. Malik took a breath. "I don't want special treatment," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to be treated like I matter, like I belong here." Ms. Hudson nodded stiffly. "You do." It was not a victory speech. It wasn't a cinematic moment, but it was enough. The eyes that looked at Malik now did not carry the same edge of derision. Some held embarrassment, others recognition, and Malik stood a little straighter. The helicopter blades began to whir again. William looked at his grandson. "Time to go." Malik glanced at the crowd, then nodded. As they walked back toward the helicopter, the crowd parted once more. The doors closed behind them, and the aircraft lifted slowly into the sky, the wind chasing dust across the field. But even after the sound of the blades faded, something else lingered in the air, something unspoken but deeply felt, something that would not disappear when the day ended. The days that followed the helicopter's descent onto Willow Creek High School's football field unfolded like the slow aftermath of a storm. For most, life resumed its familiar rhythm, but something subtle, almost imperceptible, had shifted beneath the surface. The usual noise of the hallways returned: laughter, footsteps, the dull murmur of teenage conversation, but the energy had changed. It hummed quieter now, heavier, like a song sung in a different key. Malik walked those hallways with a strange sort of awareness. The stares had not vanished. The whispers had not disappeared entirely, but the sharp edges had dulled. He caught students glancing at him when they thought he wasn't looking, their expressions softer, curious, unsure. Teachers, too, met his eyes more often, some offering tight nods or polite smiles they had never spared him before. And everywhere he went, the echo of that moment on the football field seemed to follow him, the way his grandfather's voice had carried over the crowd, the hush that had fallen as he spoke, the weight of words that had not just been about Malik, but about all the invisible lines that ran through that school, dividing who mattered from who did not. But it wasn't over yet. 2 days after the helicopter incident, an announcement came over the loudspeakers at the start of second period. The principal's voice, always crisp and professional, held a note of gravity that drew the attention of every student. "All students and faculty are requested to gather in the auditorium at noon today," he said. "Attendance is mandatory." A ripple passed through the classrooms like a breeze through tall grass. Speculation spread quickly. Some joked about another unexpected visitor. Others whispered that it had to do with what had happened earlier that week. Malik said nothing, but a knot twisted in his stomach all the same. When noon arrived, the corridors flooded with students shuffling toward the auditorium. The building itself seemed to lean inward, the air thick with anticipation. Malik found himself walking alongside his classmates, their voices buzzing around him, but he felt oddly removed, like a man wading through a dream. The auditorium filled quickly, the low murmur of conversation building and breaking like waves against a shore. Teachers lined the walls, their arms folded, expressions guarded. On stage, the principal stood waiting, flanked by a few faculty members, including Ms. Hudson. Her posture was stiff, her eyes trained on a spot near the back of the auditorium. Malik took a seat near the edge of the middle row, his hands resting on his knees. His grandfather sat alone on the stage, not at the podium, but on one of the folding chairs set slightly to the side, his broad frame relaxed but steady. He wore no jacket today, just a clean, pressed shirt, jeans, and his boots polished until they shone. The crowd quieted when the principal stepped up to the microphone. "Students, faculty," he began, his voice formal. "As many of you know, there was an incident earlier this week that sparked considerable attention, both within our school and in the community." He paused, scanning the sea of faces. "Mr. William Brown, whom most of you now know, has asked for the opportunity to address you all. I trust you will give him the courtesy of your attention." The principal stepped back. William Brown stood. He walked to the microphone without haste, his steps even, unhurried. When he reached it, he glanced over the audience, taking them in not as a crowd, but as individuals. His eyes lingered on no one in particular, yet it felt as if he looked at each person in turn. When he spoke, his voice was low and clear, every word deliberate. "I wasn't much older than some of you when I first learned how small the world can make you feel." The auditorium was silent. "I was raised right here in this county. My hands have known nothing but soil since I was old enough to walk. I know what it's like to step into a room and see the looks, the ones that tell you you're not enough, that you don't belong." He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping over them. "My grandson learned that lesson this week, in front of all of you." A murmur stirred at the edges of the room. William Brown continued. "I came here the other day because I wanted to remind a few folks of something they seem to have forgotten. But I didn't come today to lecture you about respect or fairness. Those words get thrown around too easily. Today, I want to talk to you about something much harder." He paused. "Dignity." He let the word hang in the air, heavy as stone. You see, dignity is not something anyone can hand you. It's not something you can buy with money, or dress up in fancy clothes, or prove with a degree. Dignity is something you carry, and it is forged in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when it would be easier to lay down and let the world walk over you. His voice deepened, softening slightly. "My grandson didn't ask for anyone's pity. He didn't come into your school asking for special treatment. All he wanted was to stand beside you, to be seen, to be heard, to be treated as worthy, not because of what he wore, not because of the dirt under his fingernails, but because he is human." A hush spread over the room, the weight of the words pulling every ear toward him. "You laughed at him," William said, not unkindly, but without flinching. "Some of you whispered about him behind your hands. Some of you ignored him altogether, and I don't hold that against you. It's easy to follow the crowd. It's harder to look at the person standing alone." He glanced toward Malik briefly, then back at the crowd. "I want you to understand this. Who you are will not be written by the people who mock you. It will not be measured by the ones who underestimate you. It will be written by how you carry yourself when no one thinks you matter." He shifted slightly, the microphone crackling as he leaned back. "I spent my whole life being told what I couldn't do, that I wasn't smart enough, rich enough, white enough. And every day I got up, I worked harder than the day before, and I told myself that their words didn't define me. His gaze grew sharper. Dignity is earned in the mud and the dust. It's earned when you choose to stand tall even after you've been knocked down. A long pause followed, filled only by the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. "And now," William said quietly, "I want you all to look at Malik Brown." The crowd turned. "Not because he stood next to me when I landed that helicopter on your football field," William continued. "Not because of my name, but because despite everything, he walked into this school every day and kept his head up, because he never let any of you take his dignity." For a moment, the silence was so deep it seemed to swallow the room whole. Then William stepped back, his shoulders square, his expression calm. The principal approached the microphone again, but he didn't speak immediately. He glanced at William, then at the assembled students as if unsure how to follow what had just been said. At last, he cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Brown," he said quietly. "Students, you are dismissed." The auditorium remained quiet as the students began to rise, the usual noise muted, almost reverent. No one rushed to the doors, no one shoved or joked. Malik remained seated for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stage. His grandfather caught his eye, nodded once, then turned to leave. Malik stood slowly, the students around him shifting, parting without comment. Some glanced at him furtively, their expressions unreadable. Others looked away. By the time he reached the hallway, the usual chaos had begun to return. The murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors. But something lingered in the air, something quieter, heavier. He walked to his locker without speaking, without meeting anyone's eyes. But when he closed the metal door and turned, he found himself face to face with Ms. Hudson. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she nodded once, curtly, stiffly. "I heard what your grandfather said," she said, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. Malik met her gaze evenly. So did everyone. She hesitated as if weighing her words, then nodded again. "You deserved better." Malik didn't respond. He didn't need to. As she walked away, he exhaled slowly, the knot in his chest loosening just slightly. That afternoon, as he stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the weight he carried felt a little lighter. The words still echoed in his ears, ringing clear as bells. Dignity is earned in the mud and the dust. And Malik Brown knew, finally, that he carried it with him. The morning light that spilled over Willow Creek the day after William Brown's speech felt different, though the world itself had not changed. The sun rose the same way it always did, slow and golden, painting long shadows across the fields that stretched out beyond the horizon. The low hum of crickets still clung to the air, and the scent of damp soil drifted on the breeze. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something had quietly shifted. Malik felt it as soon as he stepped outside, the early chill brushing against his skin as he crossed the porch. The weight that had pressed against his shoulders for so long no longer sat there in the same way. It hadn't disappeared, not entirely, but it had loosened, become something he could carry without bending under it. He moved through the morning chores as he always did, his hands steady and practiced. The animals greeted him with the same restless sounds, the fields waiting patiently for attention. The barn doors creaked open beneath his touch, the hay crunching beneath his boots. It was routine, the same motions he had performed every day since he was old enough to hold a shovel, but it felt different now. Lighter, steadier. His grandfather's voice echoed faintly in his mind, not as a shout, but as something quiet and unshakable. Dignity is earned in the mud and the dust. When the work was done, Malik returned to the house, the smell of breakfast meeting him at the door. His mother stood at the stove, her movements measured, her expression unreadable. "You're up early," she said without turning. "Always am," Malik replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She glanced at him then, her eyes lingering on him longer than usual. There was something softer there, something that hadn't been there before. Not relief exactly, but something close to pride. They ate in comfortable silence, the soft clink of forks against plates the only sound between them. When it was time to leave, she didn't say much, just handed him his backpack and rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. The drive to school felt quieter than it had in weeks. The road unspooled before them in familiar stretches of asphalt and red clay, the fields rolling out on either side. Malik stared out the window, his reflection faint against the glass, the sun rising behind him. When they pulled into the school parking lot, the usual crowd of students milled about the front steps, their conversations rising and falling in uneven rhythms. Malik stepped out of the car, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and made his way toward the entrance. Something changed then. It wasn't loud, not like the applause on the football field, not like the silence that had followed his grandfather's speech. It was quieter than that, almost invisible. Students looked at him differently. Some nodded as he passed. Some offered tight, almost shy smiles. Others simply stepped aside, no longer whispering, no longer laughing behind their hands. There were still glances, still the weight of being seen, but it carried something else now. Recognition, maybe even respect. In his first class, the teacher paused briefly when Malik entered, her eyes flicking to him before she continued the lesson. She didn't call on him unnecessarily. She didn't ignore him either. By second period, Malik noticed the way his classmates shifted when he walked past, the way they made room without hesitation, the way they glanced at him not as the boy who mucked stalls at dawn, but as someone who had stood in front of them and refused to bow his head. The change wasn't immediate, not entirely. There were still students who kept their distance, who whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. But the cruelty was gone, or at least diminished. The laughter that had followed him for so long had faded into something quieter, something Malik no longer had to duck away from. At lunch, he sat at his usual table near the back of the cafeteria. But this time he wasn't alone for long. A boy from his history class approached, tray in hand, hesitating for a moment before asking if he could sit. Malik nodded without a word. Another girl joined them a few minutes later, her eyes darting nervously toward him before she sat down. They didn't talk much, but they sat, and that, Malik knew, was enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small moments. Teachers who met his gaze without the usual indifference. Students who greeted him in the hallways. A janitor who gave him a knowing nod as he swept the floors. Each moment settled over him like dust. Quiet but undeniable. When the final bell rang, Malik walked through the school's front doors and paused on the steps, the sunlight warm against his skin. Students spilled out around him, their conversations rising in familiar cadences. He watched them for a moment, taking it in. He could see the difference now, not in them, but in himself. The walk home felt lighter than it had in months. His mother's car waited for him at the curb, the engine humming quietly. When he climbed inside, she glanced at him, her brow lifting slightly. "How was your day?" she asked. Malik considered for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Better." That evening, after the chores were done and the sun had dipped low in the sky, Moloch stood at the edge of the field, the cool breeze tugging at the brim of his cap. The land stretched out before him, the rows of crops neat and orderly beneath the fading light. His grandfather approached quietly, his footsteps soft against the dirt. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past weeks settling around them. "Wasn't about me," William said finally, his voice low. "It was about you." Moloch nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know." The older man glanced at him then, something close to a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "You did good, boy." Moloch didn't respond. He didn't need to. The next morning, he rose before the sun as always. He moved through the chores with quiet purpose, the rhythm of the work grounding him. And when he stepped into the school hallway later that day, he carried himself differently. Not because the whispers had stopped, not because the laughter had faded, but because he had learned something far more valuable. Dignity wasn't something anyone could give or take. It lived inside him, steady and unshakable, born in the mud and the dust and the quiet strength of standing tall when the world tried to make him small. And now, when the students of Willow Creek High looked at Moloch Brown, they no longer saw just the farm boy in worn boots and a flannel shirt. They saw a boy who had taught them something they hadn't known they needed to learn. That who you are is not written by the hands that point and laugh. It is written by how you choose to stand when no one is standing beside you. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Watch our other videos for more powerful stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.